Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis, I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center, and today we're going to be looking at revising creative writing. How do you approach revisions for creative pieces? In addition to working in the Writing Support Center, I also teach poetry at PCC. So before we begin, I do want to go over how to get the most out of this workshop. So first, please be sure to complete the accompanying activity worksheet. This can be found in the module in which you accessed this video. And this worksheet just demonstrates to your professor that you watched the workshop in its entirety, and you'll be eligible for either assignment completion or extra credit. We also encourage you to take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind any parts that were confusing or went too fast. You could take this at your own pace. I also want to go over the agenda and objectives for today's workshop. So for the agenda, we're going to review where to begin with revision, providing feedback to someone else's work, and how do you know that a piece is done? By the end of this workshop, you will be able to use poetic terms appropriately, understand different processes and strategies for approaching revision, and implement strategies for revision in your own writing process. Before we dive into the context, I do want to start off with a small reflection activity. So please be sure to complete this activity in the accompanying worksheet that's found in the module. And I want you to think about your process when you begin to revise your creative work. So when you go back to revise your creative work, what are some common questions that come up for you? Are you able to dive in quickly, or do you often struggle with where to start? What about the revision process sparks these feelings? So why is revision important? So revision gives you the opportunity to further develop themes. So when you're writing that first draft, a lot of the purpose is just to get the story, the vision onto the page, and just trying to get everything out. And so sometimes what that means is that we might be missing some areas. We might have started on a theme or on a certain plot point, but we might not develop it fully because we're just trying to get everything that's in our head onto the page. So some areas might need to be revisited and improved. And that's what revision really allows us to do. It allows us to go back to those areas that we didn't get the chance to fully develop and flourish them a little more. It also gives us the opportunity to experiment. So you're getting the opportunity to play with structure. You can add in or take out lines, dialogue, scenes, etc. If you had a plot twist in mind that you weren't sure about, this might be the chance to play with it and add it in and see what kind of new story that plot twist takes you on. So revision just gives you the chance to see what else your story could be, and or your creative piece could be, and really just let that take shape as well. Revision also allows you to see what's working and what's not working. So after you finish a piece, we tend to walk away from it. We'll get feedback from other folks. Maybe we're just taking a break from it altogether. So when you do come back to it, you're coming back with a fresh pair of eyes. And those fresh pair of eyes allow us to see what was strong and really resonated with readers, what really resonated with us, and then what's maybe no longer working. And now that we see that those parts aren't working, how do we take that out? How do we mold it so that it does work for the piece that we want? One of the concerns that I often hear from my students when being asked to approach revision is that they really want to keep their material raw. So maybe the piece was a very emotional piece, maybe it was a very personal piece, and they want to keep a lot of those genuine emotions in there, and they feel like the original piece is the only way that they can keep those genuine emotions. And to that, I always respond with, revision doesn't mean taking out raw emotions because you're polishing it, but rather it's the opportunity to enhance the emotions, really see how you can refine and add to the experiences or the story that you're telling. Maybe there's a metaphor that you started in the beginning of the piece, and you're realizing, like, if I enhance this metaphor, people will really see what it is that I'm trying to convey. Maybe there were some things that when you were writing, some details that maybe you did not include in the beginning, but now you're realizing you need to go back and add that in. So that's the opportunity to do so. Um, you know, revision doesn't mean that your revision and bringing polish to a piece doesn't mean that you're taking away those genuine raw emotions. It's just really the opportunity to see how can you make sure that those raw emotions are coming through clear, and you're really leaving the reader with that emotional takeaway. And one thing that I also tell them to consider is that your favorite raw pieces, whether that's a creative nonfiction piece, whether that's a poem, a novel, a short story, those pieces were likely revised in some way or another. And it doesn't take away from how impactful it was, but rather it added to it. And that is what we want to do for our own writing. So part of the revision process may include workshop strategies. So if you're not familiar with workshop is when you're with a group of people and you're sharing work with one another, and you're allowing one another to give feedback to others' writing. And so the workshop strategies that I'm going to share are the Liz Lerman method, and this method really centers the writer. So the writer is going to guide the conversation, but it also focuses on community, recognizing that the participant and the writer are having a dialogue over the writer's work and trying to see how the writer can improve on the piece that they shared. And so first and foremost, if as a participant, we encourage you to offer statements of meaning. So this is where you're sharing with the writer parts that were stimulating, surprising, evocating, unique, etc. You're refraining from sharing just what you like, but rather sharing why you liked it, sharing with the writer what it was about a certain area that you're highlighting that really resonated with you, and why you feel it was successful. That why is much more important to the writer than saying, I liked it. Because when you're just telling the writer that you liked something, the writer is just going to be like, okay, cool, I'm glad you liked it. But you're not telling them what made that part very powerful for you. Whereas if you explain the why, the writer is able to then take that why and try to see how they can apply it to other parts of their writing. So for example, if you really liked the opening of the poem that they shared, and you explain why you liked it, you liked it because it dropped the reader straight into the scene. It started the urgency. It set a great tone, great pacing. The writer can then take that aspect and try to see if they can apply it to other other pieces of writing. So either a different poem, or maybe they'll apply it to a later part in the poem. Maybe they'll start all their stanzas with that urgency, etc. So explaining the why really allows the writer to see how they can take their strengths and apply it elsewhere. Like I said, the writer in this method has a lot of agency. So as the artist, you're going to pose questions. So the writer is going to moderate the conversation by posing craft-based questions. So in your class, you're most likely learning about different craft elements, different writing strategies that you can use, or that go into the type of creative work that you're working on. And when you're in workshop, you want to make sure that you're creating that you have questions based around those strategies. So um, for example, asking questions about is whether your dialogue is believable, whether your dialogue is unique. Does every character have a unique voice when they're speaking, or do they all sound the same? Questions like that. You want to make sure that they're really focused on a certain craft element and that they're not too narrow or they're too broad. Another strategy for workshop is that the respondents pose neutral questions. So one thing to remember is that at the end of the day, the writer is always going to decide what they want to work on and what they are not going to work on. And so as a participant, you have to be mindful of that. And you want to make sure that you're removing yourself from the conversation and rather instead asking questions to gain insight regarding the writer's intentions. So if there's a part that you found kind of confusing or a part where you are not really sure what the purpose of it is in the work, ask the writer about it. So for example, if there was an action that a character did and you feel like it was a little out of character based off of what you know and what you've read so far, ask the writer, what was your intention behind having this character make this decision? And from there, the writer can explain like, oh, thank you, like this was the purpose of it. And then you can let them know, oh, I didn't really get that, or that wasn't something that I really understood. And the writer can then see like, oh, if my reader doesn't understand the intention, then I need to develop that a little more in a different area. So again, trying to gain insight regarding the writer's intentions before giving your thought process. And that leads me into another strategy where participants raise permissioned opinions. So instead of outright saying like, I think you should eliminate this, or I think you should add this, as a participant, name the topic of your opinion and then ask for permission to share it. And then from there, the writer has the chance to accept, decline, or save it. And if a writer declines it, don't take it as a personal attack that they don't want to listen to you. Maybe they want to decline it because maybe the opinion that you want to share is something that they're not currently prioritizing. So for example, if you want to share feedback on the opening sequence, but the writer really wants to focus on the dialogue, they might ask you to either save it for the end, or they might say thank you, but like at this time I really just want to focus on this piece. And that might be just a strategy for them in order for them to keep things in order. And as a writer, you have to know what it is you want to focus on with each step of revision, because trying to revise everything all at once might be a little daunting, overwhelming. Focusing on one craft element at a time is actually really helpful. Another strategy when you're going through a workshop is to have an artist reflection. So at the end of your workshop, really taking the time to thank your participants and speak on what you gained from the workshop. Again, it's a community experience, so thanking everyone for their time and their energy, and then also what you're taking away from that workshop allows everyone to feel heard, like it was a productive session. And then in this reflection, you're also going to acknowledge what you want to do moving forward. So you will identify one or more points of revision. And this is really the most important piece, because you are making a conscious decision of what you want to focus on when you go back to this piece and start rewriting it. So really keeping that in mind. And this will help you when you're revising your work on your own. So we're going to do our second activity, and this is going to be some workshop prep. So we're going to primarily focus on Liz Lerman's second strategy of having craft-based questions. So using that strategy, create 3 questions to ask your peers to receive more guided feedback. Remember to make sure they're not too broad or too narrow. So choose either 3 craft elements, or choose 1 craft element and 3 questions about that craft element that you have, and try to develop 3 questions that you would ask your peers in order to gain more guided feedback. All right, but now we're talking about outside of workshops. So you may not have the opportunity to workshop every single piece you write in your class. This all depends on how your professors is structuring their their class. You know, some professors structure it so that everyone gets every piece revised, or others will structure it where you're only getting 1 piece revised throughout the entire semester. But, you know, we want to also have strategies on how to revise our own work on our own time. So first, it's really helpful to look over the piece and consider the genre, the style, and elements such as dialogue, description, title, etc., and really seeing how every piece is working together in order to create this one cohesive creative work. You also want to read the piece out loud. Really consider sounds, images, and clunky places. If there's any part where it sounds like it's getting a little convoluted or a little confusing, those might be places where you look to like reorder it or rewrite it. It's also helpful to read the piece silently all the way through and mark places that you want to revisit for yourself. Maybe it's something that for some reason it doesn't sit right with you just yet, but you want to go back to it when you're maybe in the headspace to see why it doesn't sit right just yet. And then also read through any possible peer review questions and use that as an additional guide for your piece. That could also be helpful when you're going through your revisions. When you're reviewing your work, you want to also reflect on what gave you trouble. So thinking back to when you were initially writing it, what were parts that got you stuck and why did it make you stuck? When you're looking at it with your fresh pair of eyes, are there ways that you can improve that area? Was there peer feedback that you received that maybe can help you try to approach that area a little better, etc.? What do you feel is strong? So did you develop strong characters or storyline? Is your imagery spot on? You really want to think about what your strengths are and use that as motivation and see where you can add more of that into your piece. And that can also help you resolve some of the areas that have been giving you trouble. So using your strengths to uplift different areas of your work. Consider peer feedback. So again, we went through this whole workshopping section, and peer feedback is a great way to consider where to begin with your revisions. You know, going back to the workshop, you want to leave workshop with 1 or 2 points of revision. Look back at that and see how you can apply that to not just the piece that you have feedback on, but other pieces that you're working on. Ultimately, you decide what changes you are going to make. It is your work and you have agency over that work. But also be open to different ideas or different perspectives. Another strategy for when you're reviewing your own work is to save your darlings. So in creative writing, there's a really common saying called kill your darlings. And normally what this refers to is being open to taking out full lines, full paragraphs, full scenes, being comfortable taking that out of your writing. And normally, if the idea originally was taking that out completely and never looking at it ever again. But I want to provide a different perspective and consider saving our darlings. So yes, be comfortable with taking things out, but instead of deleting it, have a separate document where you save that, where you save that one line, that one metaphor, that one scene altogether, that one chapter if you're working on a novel, and consider it to be used at a different time. Maybe its home was not in the piece that you're working on right now, but it might be in a different piece that you decide to write in the future. And then when you're reviewing your own work, you also want to consider experimenting with structure. So is that opening line or scene a stronger ending line or scene? Are there ways that you can play with the page or the storytelling structure? You know, really think of your piece and your experience in the class as this large learning experience. Maybe when you wrote the piece, if you wrote a poem or a short story at the beginning of the semester, maybe throughout the semester you've read new writers, you've learned new craft elements, and now is the opportunity to apply those new things that you've learned into this piece that you wrote at the beginning of the semester, and really just having the chance to experiment and see how you can take different styles and make it your own. So we're going to go into our last activity, and this is our self-review activity. So choose a creative piece that you have written for class and begin to make some initial revisions, either using Liz Lerman's strategies, or looking at different craft elements. You want to start making some of those revisions, and consider the following questions. What gave you trouble with this piece? Is that something you can work on for a new draft? Are there themes that are coming through clearly? If so, how? If not, what can you do to improve it? What do you feel was strong in this piece? Can you add more of that in your work? So, but how do you know a piece is done? That is another common question that I get from my students. Sometimes revision can be very overwhelming. We are often looking at our pieces and feeling like there is just always something that's going to be off. And so we can go on and on and on with revision, trying to make sure that it's perfect. So how do we decide that something is done and finished? And I'm actually going to hand this off to one of my favorite poets, Sarah Kay, who talks about how do you decide when a piece is finished and you just have to begin letting it go. Because ultimately, we're never going to feel like a piece is 100% finished, and we're never going to feel 100% satisfied with it. So as you watch the video, really just think about what she is saying in terms of deciding when a piece is done and how we can begin to let go of our writing and consider it good, ready for publication, for our final portfolio, etc. So Sarah Kay really is telling us that we're always going to be stumbling. We're always going to feel like we want to try to find the perfect way to tell something, and sometimes that comes from our own um, perspective and our own attempts of trying to find solutions to the problems that we may be writing about in our own lives. And just because sometimes we just are using our writing as a time machine and as this one glimpse of time into what we're going through. It's not always the case for everyone's writing. But it is something to think about when you're thinking of how do I know that my piece is done and it's ready for publication, for portfolio, etc. So that brings us to the end of our workshop. And as a summary, I want to remind you that revision is a great opportunity for experimentation. It's a chance to take risks with your writing, um, and really just break out of your comfort zone, or really just lean into something that you may have started, a certain metaphor, a certain image, etc., and take that a step further. Feedback from your peers provides starting points for revision. So if you're having another person look at your writing, really using that feedback as a jumping point and as a place to consider where to start when you're approaching revision. It may take multiple reads for you to decide where to make changes. So make sure that you're reading through your work and multiple times and focusing on maybe one or two things at a time. So that way it's not becoming an overwhelming process. And lastly, deciding when to be done is difficult, but it has to come. We all must eventually let go of our piece and decide this is where it's going to be at this moment, and it is now ready for publication or for portfolio. So thank you all for watching this workshop. I hope you have gotten some really helpful strategies. As always, we are here to support you in any way that you can. So thank you and have a nice evening.